You don't belong on this carpet." The sentence landed harder than the flash of 100 cameras, stopping conversations, silencing laughter, and freezing the steady rhythm of polished shoes against the marble entrance of the Brooks Foundation Charity Gala. Naomi Brooks slowly turned toward the young woman holding a gold guest list tablet, her expression calm enough to make the surrounding tension feel even louder. The volunteer coordinator crossed her arms with practiced confidence, glancing from Naomi's plain navy dress to her simple flats before shaking her head. "This event is invitation only," she repeated, louder this time, making sure nearby donors could hear every word. A few people paused beneath the crystal lights, curiosity replacing polite smiles as whispers floated through the evening air. Naomi looked at the digital invitation resting on her phone and then back at the woman blocking her path. "My name is Naomi Brooks," she answered softly. The coordinator barely looked at the screen before pushing it away with 2 fingers. "I'm sure it is." A man wearing a tailored tuxedo stepped closer with a rehearsed smile that never reached his eyes. His silver name badge identified him as event manager Daniel Whitmore. He scanned Naomi from head to toe and nodded once, as if confirming an assumption already made. "Ma'am, our VIP guests are arriving. If you're looking for the public fundraiser, that's 2 blocks east." Several guests chuckled politely, believing they had just witnessed an awkward misunderstanding. Naomi didn't move. She simply stood beneath the glow of the entrance lights, hands folded, shoulders relaxed, almost as if she had expected this exact moment. Daniel sighed and checked his expensive watch. "Please don't create a scene." Those words drifted across the red carpet like invisible smoke. A photographer lowered his camera. An elderly couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. A college intern arranging flower displays quietly looked up from across the lobby, recognizing something that everyone else seemed determined to ignore. Naomi's face remained unreadable. Years earlier, she had learned that silence could expose more than anger ever could. Daniel gestured toward a velvet rope. "Real sponsors are checking in over there." Naomi followed the direction of his hand and noticed a line of executives laughing beneath enormous banners carrying one familiar name in elegant gold lettering: Brooks Foundation Annual Legacy Gala. The irony almost invited a smile, but she refused to give the moment that satisfaction. Another guest stepped around her, holding out an embossed invitation. Without checking identification, the coordinator welcomed him inside with enthusiasm. "We're honored you're here, Mr. Collins." The doors opened. Music spilled into the night. Naomi remained outside. The contrast was impossible to ignore. More phones quietly appeared in waiting hands, not because anyone expected history to unfold, but because something about the calm woman being denied entry felt strangely important. Daniel lowered his voice. "Listen, if someone gave you an invitation as a joke, we can avoid embarrassing you any further." Naomi finally met his eyes. Her voice stayed even, carrying no frustration and no urgency. "I'm already exactly where I'm supposed to be." The answer confused him more than any argument could have. The intern across the lobby frowned and glanced at the master guest registry glowing on her monitor. Her fingers hesitated above the keyboard. The name at the very top looked unexpectedly familiar. She blinked once, then twice, as the realization slowly reached her. Outside, luxury cars continued pulling up every 30 seconds. Camera flashes painted silver across the sidewalk, and the city's most influential guests walked confidently through doors that opened without question. Only one person stood still, perfectly composed beneath the towering lights, while everyone around her unknowingly stepped into a story that would change the meaning of belonging before the night was over. Daniel Whitmore stepped half a pace closer, confident enough to believe the conversation had already ended, while Naomi Brooks quietly stepped away from the velvet rope and stood beside a marble column overlooking the entrance as if she had nowhere else she needed to be. The orchestra inside shifted into a gentle jazz arrangement, and warm golden lights spilled through the glass doors every time another guest entered, wrapping strangers in effortless welcome while leaving one woman outside the celebration carrying her own name across the banners no one had bothered to truly read. A volunteer hurried toward Daniel, holding a stack of printed seating cards. "Table 12 is missing one donor confirmation," she whispered. Daniel accepted the papers without taking his eyes off Naomi. "Handle it. We cannot have distractions tonight." Naomi heard every word but showed no reaction. Her hands rested loosely in front of her, and her posture remained perfectly balanced, the kind of quiet confidence that could only come from someone who no longer needed approval from any room. A young couple arriving for the gala slowed their steps and looked toward her. The husband lowered his voice. "Did something happen?" Before anyone else could answer, Daniel smiled politely and said, "Just a registration issue. We are taking care of it." The couple nodded and continued inside, trusting authority more than observation. Across the lobby, the intern named Olivia Harper stared at the glowing guest registry once again. She typed the name Naomi Brooks into the search field and watched a single profile immediately appear at the very top with a gold symbol she had never seen before. Executive Founder Access. Unlimited Venue Authorization. Olivia blinked and refreshed the page, convinced she had entered the wrong name. But the result remained unchanged. Her heartbeat quickened as she remembered orientation week, when senior staff explained that only one person in the organization carried that designation and that most employees would probably never meet her in person. Olivia slowly lifted her eyes toward the woman waiting outside and found nothing that matched the image she had imagined. There was no designer gown worth thousands of dollars, no security detail, no luxury jewelry catching the light, only simple elegance and remarkable patience. The contrast made the silence around Naomi feel even larger. A photographer adjusted his camera and quietly asked another media worker, "Do you know who she is?" The other man shrugged. "No idea, but she is calmer than everyone else here." Inside the ballroom, applause erupted as another sponsor arrived, echoing through the entrance before fading into polished conversation. Naomi watched reflections move across the glass and for a brief moment remembered another evening nearly 25 years earlier when she stood outside a scholarship dinner wearing the only black dress she could afford. She had been told there was no record of her invitation even after earning the highest academic award in her class. She had waited on the sidewalk until a professor finally recognized her and walked her inside. That night, she promised herself that success would never erase memory and dignity would never depend on appearance. The promise had followed her through every company she built and every foundation she funded. Olivia took one cautious step away from the registration desk, uncertainty pulling her forward while fear tried to hold her back. Daniel noticed the movement immediately and raised an eyebrow. "Stay focused on check-in," he said without turning around. Olivia stopped, but her eyes returned to Naomi, who simply looked toward the city skyline as evening lights reflected across the polished stone like quiet stars resting at ground level. Around them, expensive shoes crossed the red carpet every few seconds. Conversations floated through the warm spring air, and no one realized that the calmest person at the entrance understood every detail of the evening better than anyone already celebrating inside. Daniel Whitmore folded his hands in front of him and smiled with the quiet confidence of a man who believed every expensive suit entering the building confirmed his judgment. He glanced toward two security ambassadors standing near the revolving doors and gave a subtle nod that looked almost invisible to everyone except Naomi Brooks. They immediately walked closer, not hurried, not aggressive, simply present enough to create the impression that someone did not belong. The polished entrance suddenly felt smaller even as hundreds of crystal lights reflected across marble floors that stretched almost 100 feet into the grand lobby. Naomi remained exactly where she was, her attention drifting toward the enormous portrait hanging above the staircase, a painting commissioned years earlier to celebrate generosity, leadership, and inclusion. Guests admired it every year without ever knowing the woman standing beneath it had approved every brushstroke. A wealthy donor carrying a glass of sparkling water stopped beside Daniel and quietly asked, "Is there a problem?" Daniel answered with effortless certainty, "Nothing serious. We are protecting the integrity of the event." The donor nodded immediately and walked away, satisfied by a sentence that sounded official enough to become truth. Nearby, Olivia Harper could no longer ignore the glowing gold icon on her registration screen. She opened the profile again and read every line carefully. Founder, lifetime chair, executive override. She swallowed hard, looking from the monitor back to Naomi and then toward Daniel, whose attention never left the woman waiting outside the invisible wall created by assumption. Another volunteer leaned toward Olivia and whispered, Why are you staring at the system? Olivia lowered her voice. Something does not make sense. Before she could explain, Daniel called across the lobby. Olivia, I need confirmation that every executive sponsor is checked in. His tone carried the polite authority that discouraged questions before they could form. Olivia quickly minimized the screen, but uncertainty continued growing inside her. At that moment, a luxury sedan stopped beneath the covered entrance, and a famous technology investor stepped onto the carpet wearing dark jeans, white sneakers, and a plain jacket. The volunteer coordinator greeted him with excitement, smiling so broadly that nearby cameras immediately turned toward him. No invitation was requested. No identification was checked. The doors opened without hesitation. Naomi watched the effortless welcome and then quietly looked down at her own simple navy dress, not with disappointment, but with recognition. She had seen the pattern before. Different city, different building, same assumptions. The orchestra shifted into another melody while conversations flowed around crystal chandeliers, yet the atmosphere near the entrance became heavier with every passing minute. Guests who had never met Naomi began observing her with curiosity instead of suspicion simply because she refused to leave. Calm has a strange way of making doubt travel in unexpected directions. A photographer lowered his camera and muttered to another reporter. Usually people argue by now. The other reporter answered. She looks like she is waiting for everyone else to catch up. Daniel overheard the exchange and straightened his jacket. Ma'am, I am asking one final time. If your invitation cannot be verified, I will have to request that you exit the reception area. Naomi finally looked directly at him, her voice measured and almost gentle. You have been looking at me for 10 minutes, and you still have not looked at the name I gave you. The sentence hung in the warm air like the final note of a piano concerto. Olivia slowly stood from behind the registration desk, clutching a printed guest manifest in trembling hands while her eyes moved between the first name listed on the page and the woman everyone else seemed determined not to recognize. Olivia Harper took one careful step away from the registration desk, the printed guest manifest held tightly against her chest as though the paper itself had suddenly become heavier. Every instinct told her to remain silent, to trust the people with titles and tailored suits. Yet the glowing gold designation on the screen refused to leave her mind. She looked once more at Naomi Brooks, who still stood beneath the towering glass entrance with the same quiet composure that had unsettled the entire lobby. Around them, conversation slowed without completely stopping. Guests pretended to admire floral arrangements while listening to every word. Camera lenses drifted away from celebrities and settled on the woman no one seemed willing to welcome. Daniel Whitmore noticed Olivia approaching and offered a reassuring smile, meant to restore order before uncertainty could spread. Everything is under control, he announced loudly enough for nearby donors to hear. Olivia stopped beside him and lowered her voice. Sir, I think there may be a mistake. Daniel accepted the printed manifest without looking at it. There is no mistake. Olivia hesitated for only a second before speaking again. Her name is listed first. Daniel finally glanced at the page, but instead of reading it carefully, he folded it once and returned it to her. The executive list is confidential. Please return to your station. The answer carried authority, yet it lacked curiosity, and several guests noticed. A silver-haired woman standing near the staircase quietly frowned. She had attended the gala for 8 consecutive years and had learned that real confidence never rushed to dismiss questions. A local journalist holding a media pass leaned toward another reporter and whispered, "Why does the intern look more certain than the manager?" The second reporter slowly raised his phone, not to create a spectacle, but to remember details that suddenly felt important. Olivia gathered enough courage to take another step. I also checked the digital registry twice, she said. The profile shows founder-level authorization. For the first time that evening, complete silence settled across the entrance. Daniel laughed politely, a controlled sound that invited everyone else to dismiss the statement with him. You are still learning the system. Naomi remained perfectly still, watching neither side, almost as though she trusted truth to arrive without assistance. The silver-haired donor unexpectedly walked toward Olivia. Young lady, she asked gently, are you saying this guest is supposed to be here? Olivia nodded before fear could change her answer. Yes, ma'am. Everything in the system says she belongs. Another guest joined the conversation, followed by a photographer and then a volunteer arranging welcome gifts. None of them knew Naomi personally, yet the atmosphere had begun to shift from suspicion toward curiosity. Calm certainty was proving stronger than confident assumption. Daniel adjusted his jacket again and addressed the growing circle with practiced diplomacy. Technology can produce errors. Let us continue the evening without unnecessary confusion. Naomi finally lifted her eyes toward Olivia, offering nothing more than a small, grateful smile. It lasted less than a second, but it steadied the young intern far more than applause ever could. Olivia straightened her shoulders and quietly said, "I do not think the system is confused." The words floated through the grand entrance like a single candle illuminating a room that had been bright all along, yet somehow unable to see. One by one, guests began looking not at Naomi's simple dress or comfortable shoes, but at her calm presence, her effortless dignity, and the remarkable patience of someone who never once demanded respect, yet somehow inspired strangers to defend it. Somewhere inside the ballroom, the orchestra reached the final note of its performance, and for a brief, suspended moment, it seemed as though the entire gala was waiting for the same answer. The silence lasted only a heartbeat before Daniel Whitmore forced a polite smile back onto his face and took one deliberate step toward Naomi Brooks, extending an open hand that stopped just short of her shoulder, as if guiding rather than touching. "Ma'am, perhaps we should continue this conversation away from the entrance so our guests can enjoy the evening." His voice remained perfectly measured, yet every person nearby understood the message hidden beneath the courtesy. "Move aside. Become invisible." Naomi did not move. Crystal light reflected across the marble floor and settled around her like a quiet spotlight, while conversations throughout the lobby faded into whispers. Olivia Harper instinctively took another step forward but froze when Daniel looked at her. "Please return to your station," he repeated. The words were calm, but they carried enough weight to remind every junior employee where authority lived. Naomi slowly looked past the manager toward the ballroom doors where hundreds of people laughed beneath banners celebrating compassion, opportunity, and community. The contrast almost felt unreal. She closed her eyes for a brief second, and another lobby appeared in her memory. Not this one, but a small public library nearly 3 decades earlier. She was 16 years old, wearing the only Sunday dress her mother could afford, carrying a stack of borrowed books against her chest. A staff member had followed her through every aisle before quietly asking if she planned to return the books she had not even checked out yet. Other visitors had stared while she stood frozen, too young to understand why suspicion could arrive before introduction. She remembered walking outside that afternoon promising herself that one day she would build places where dignity was never something people had to earn. The memory disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by the soft sound of evening traffic beyond the glass doors. Naomi opened her eyes and found the same patient expression waiting for the world to catch up. The silver-haired donor looked from Daniel to Naomi and finally spoke. "She has remained respectful this entire time." A photographer nodded. "She has not raised her voice once." Another guest quietly added, "Then why does this feel like she is the one being asked to prove she belongs?" The questions drifted across the entrance, gathering attention with every passing second. Olivia looked down at the manifest one final time before holding it closer to her chest, no longer hiding what she had seen. Daniel noticed the growing uncertainty among the guests and straightened his tie. "Everyone, thank you for your concern. We simply have a registration discrepancy." Naomi finally answered, her voice calm enough to make every nearby whisper disappear. "Interesting. I gave my name almost 15 minutes ago. Yet no one has actually verified it. No accusation, no anger, only fact." The simplicity of the sentence unsettled the room far more than outrage could have. The local journalist quietly lowered his notebook and looked directly at Daniel. Would it not be easier to check? No one responded immediately. Somewhere inside the ballroom, a master of ceremonies invited donors to take their seats while applause echoed through the grand hall. But almost nobody standing near the entrance paid attention anymore. They were watching something else unfold, something quieter and somehow more revealing. Olivia's hands trembled as she reached toward the registration terminal again, her fingers hovering above the keyboard while courage slowly replaced hesitation. Naomi noticed the movement and offered another small reassuring smile. the kind that asked for nothing and expected nothing in return. Around them, the marble lobby no longer felt like the beginning of a charity gala. It felt like a mirror, reflecting every assumption made before a single fact had been allowed to speak. Olivia Harper lowered herself into the chair behind the registration terminal and placed the printed manifest beside the keyboard, as though she had finally decided that facts deserved a voice. The blinking cursor waited on the screen while conversations around the entrance became unusually quiet. Daniel Whitmore watched every movement with controlled confidence, certain that experience would overpower uncertainty before anyone noticed the difference. Naomi Brooks stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, hands loosely folded, looking more like an honored guest patiently waiting for friends than someone being questioned at the door. The city lights beyond the glass reflected across the polished floor, creating long ribbons of silver that seemed to lead directly toward her. Olivia inhaled slowly and entered a secure verification code she had been told never to use unless instructed by executive leadership. The screen paused for 2 seconds before expanding into a completely different interface. Gold borders appeared around the profile, and a message quietly illuminated the display. Founder access active. Executive administrative controls enabled. Olivia stared without blinking. The volunteer beside her leaned closer and whispered, "What is that?" Olivia answered without taking her eyes off the screen. "I have never seen it before." Daniel noticed the change and immediately walked toward the desk. "Close that page," he said calmly. Olivia looked up. "Sir, I think someone should review this." Daniel extended his hand toward the keyboard, but stopped before touching it, as several nearby guests instinctively looked in his direction. The local journalist quietly uncapped his pen again while the silver-haired donor folded her arms, waiting. Naomi reached into the pocket of her coat and removed a simple black phone without hurry. She unlocked it, selected one contact, and lifted it to her ear. No dramatic expression crossed her face. No frustration colored her voice. "Emily," she said softly, "please activate Event Protocol 7. There was a brief pause before a warm professional voice answered through the speaker. "Confirmed. Event Protocol 7 is now active. Internal audit sequence initiated." Naomi replied with only 2 words. "Thank you." She ended the call and returned the phone to her pocket. Nothing appeared to happen. The orchestra continued playing inside the ballroom. Guests continued arriving beneath the crystal chandeliers. Waiters carried trays of sparkling water through the grand hall. Yet somewhere beyond the visible celebration, invisible systems had quietly awakened. Across the registration desk, Olivia noticed small notification windows appearing one after another on her monitor. Executive review requested. Administrative activity logged. Live access verification in progress. She did not fully understand their meaning, but she understood enough to know they had not been triggered by accident. Daniel forced another polite smile toward the gathering crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, there is absolutely no reason for concern." His words sounded confident, but the certainty behind them had begun to thin. A photographer glanced toward Naomi and quietly remarked, "She made one phone call, and nobody is speaking anymore." The silver-haired donor smiled faintly. Sometimes the loudest power arrives in the quietest voice. Naomi remained perfectly composed, watching reflections move across the marble as if she had all the time in the world. She neither celebrated nor defended herself. She simply waited. Olivia looked once more at the golden profile glowing on her screen, and then toward the calm woman standing beneath banners carrying the Brooks Foundation name in elegant letters almost 20 feet high. For the first time that evening, she noticed what had been visible from the beginning. The portrait above the staircase, the signature engraved beneath it, and the name on the executive profile all matched exactly. A realization settled across her expression, and almost at the same moment several executive tablets throughout the ballroom emitted the same quiet notification tone, a sound so gentle that most guests barely noticed it, yet powerful enough to begin changing the direction of the entire evening. One by one, conversations inside the ballroom began fading as executive tablets illuminated across the room with the same quiet notification. Board members glanced at their screens, sponsors paused in the middle of introductions, and volunteers stopped arranging centerpieces as a single line appeared beneath the Brooks Foundation crest. Founder arriving at main entrance. Executive welcome protocol delayed. The message spread through the room faster than any announcement could have. The master of ceremonies standing beside the stage looked down at his own tablet and immediately lost the smile he had been rehearsing all evening. He checked the name twice before looking toward the grand entrance with unmistakable surprise. Outside, Daniel Whitmore still stood between Naomi Brooks and the open doors, unaware that the atmosphere behind him had already changed. Olivia Harper quietly turned her monitor so the silver-haired donor could see the glowing profile. The older woman adjusted her glasses and slowly read every word. Founder, chairwoman, executive authority. She looked back at Naomi and then at the portrait suspended above the staircase. The resemblance suddenly became impossible to ignore. A photographer followed her gaze and lowered his camera in disbelief. The local journalist whispered almost to himself, "We have all been looking at the answer from the beginning." At that exact moment, the orchestra stopped in the middle of a transition, and the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage carrying an expression no script could prepare. His voice echoed gently through the ballroom and flowed into the marble lobby beyond. "Ladies and gentlemen, before tonight's program officially begins, we have the privilege of welcoming the visionary whose commitment has transformed millions of lives across this country. Please join me in recognizing the founder of the Brooks Foundation, Ms. Naomi Brooks." Every sound disappeared. Crystal chandeliers continued sparkling above hundreds of guests, but no one moved. Heads slowly turned toward the entrance where the woman in the simple navy dress remained exactly where she had been standing for nearly 20 minutes. The silence seemed to stretch across the entire building until even the city noise beyond the glass felt distant. Daniel looked from the stage to Naomi and then toward Olivia's monitor, where the same name glowed in unmistakable gold. Color quietly left his face. The volunteer coordinator lowered her tablet without realizing it. The technology investor who had been welcomed moments earlier stared in complete disbelief. Naomi finally took one calm step forward, not hurried, not triumphant, simply continuing the walk she had attempted from the beginning. Guests instinctively moved aside, creating a clear path across the marble floor without anyone asking them to do so. She paused beside Daniel and looked at him with the same composed expression she had maintained throughout the evening. Her voice remained gentle enough that everyone leaned forward to hear every word. "You spent 20 minutes deciding that I did not belong at an event I built." No accusation followed. No raised voice. No anger. Only truth delivered with quiet certainty. The sentence settled across the lobby like a final note that refused to fade. Olivia smiled through relieved eyes while the silver-haired donor placed one hand over her heart. The photographer finally lifted his camera again, not to capture conflict, but to preserve a moment that felt larger than a gala. Around the ballroom, applause began with a single pair of hands, then another, and another, until hundreds of guests were standing together. Yet Naomi did not look toward the crowd. She looked only at the people who had judged appearance before identity, offering them something far more difficult than embarrassment. She offered them a chance to see what had been in front of them from the very first moment, a reminder that dignity does not arrive with a title and respect should never wait for recognition. The applause continued long after the surprise had settled, not loud enough to celebrate humiliation, but steady enough to honor truth finally finding its place. Naomi Brooks accepted none of the attention for herself. She simply walked through the entrance beneath the crystal chandeliers with the same calm pace she had maintained from the first moment she arrived, while guests quietly stepped aside without being asked. Daniel Whitmore remained near the velvet rope, still holding the tablet that had never once displayed the name he had refused to verify. His confidence had disappeared so completely that even his posture seemed unfamiliar. Olivia Harper followed a respectful distance behind Naomi, still carrying the printed manifest that had become the evening's unexpected witness. At the center of the ballroom, several members of the executive board were already standing, their own tablets displaying the same notification that had quietly spread throughout the building. A woman in a charcoal business suit approached Naomi with measured professionalism and offered a warm smile. "Good evening, Ms. Brooks. Event Protocol 7 has completed its initial review." Naomi nodded once. "Thank you, Emily." The executive assistant turned toward the board and spoke with calm precision. "Every registration interaction has been preserved. Timestamps, access records, and internal communications have been secured for immediate review. No accusation entered her voice. She simply described facts. Guests listened in complete silence. One by one, electronic badges carried by senior event staff emitted a gentle tone. Several screens refreshed simultaneously. Administrative privileges temporarily suspended pending executive review. Daniel looked down at his badge as its display changed from blue to gray. The volunteer coordinator watched the same message appear on her device and slowly lowered her hands. No one argued. No one protested. The systems they trusted every day were simply applying the same standards they had overlooked only minutes earlier. The silver-haired donor quietly turned toward the local journalist and whispered, "Justice can be remarkably quiet." He nodded while closing his notebook. And somehow that makes it even more powerful. Olivia noticed guests looking toward Daniel with sympathy rather than satisfaction. She realized the room had changed. The moment was no longer about punishment. It had become a lesson unfolding in real time. Naomi accepted a glass of water from a server and finally addressed the executives gathered near the stage. The review is not about one conversation. It is about every conversation that happened before tonight, and every guest who quietly walked away believing they did not belong. Her words settled over the ballroom with the same calm certainty that had carried her through the entire evening. Emily received another notification and looked toward Naomi. Additional historical service records have been attached to the review package. The board will evaluate them before the event concludes. Naomi answered with a simple nod. She did not ask for immediate decisions or public apologies. The process itself was enough. Around the ballroom, donors who had arrived expecting speeches about generosity found themselves witnessing generosity in its most difficult form, the willingness to let accountability replace anger. Daniel slowly approached Naomi, his expression no longer defensive but thoughtful. Before he could speak, she gently said, "Take tonight to understand what happened before trying to explain it." He lowered his eyes and quietly stepped back. Olivia looked toward the portrait above the staircase and then at the woman standing beneath it. For the first time, the distance between the painting and the person seemed to disappear completely. The orchestra resumed its performance. Guests gradually returned to their tables, and the gala finally began, yet everyone carried into the ballroom a different understanding of leadership. It was not announced from a stage, displayed through expensive clothing, or proven by a title on a screen. It had walked through the front entrance wearing a simple navy dress and changed an entire room without ever raising its voice. The evening continued beneath a ceiling of crystal light, but the atmosphere no longer belonged to luxury or ceremony. It belonged to reflection. Guests who had arrived expecting another elegant charity gala now spoke quietly with strangers about first impressions, silent assumptions, and the remarkable strength of a woman who had never demanded respect, yet somehow inspired an entire ballroom to reconsider its own standards. Naomi Brooks stood behind the podium only after every volunteer had taken a seat and every server had finished pouring water, insisting that the people who made the event possible deserved to enjoy it as much as the people who funded it. The applause that welcomed her was warm, but she waited until complete silence settled across the room before speaking. "Tonight was never supposed to be about me," she began, her voice steady and unhurried. "It was supposed to be about opening doors for people whose potential is often overlooked." She paused and looked toward the entrance where the evening had quietly changed direction. Sometimes the hardest doors to open are not made of glass or steel. They are built from assumptions we never stop to question. Hundreds of guests listened without moving. Olivia Harper sat near the front beside other volunteers, her printed guest manifest folded carefully in her lap, like an unexpected reminder that courage often begins with one honest sentence. Naomi smiled gently in her direction before continuing. "Leadership is measured by the people we welcome before we know their titles. Character is revealed by the respect we offer when we believe no one important is watching." The silver-haired donor slowly stood and began applauding once more, followed by the local journalist, the photographers, the volunteers, and finally the executives themselves until the ballroom filled with a quiet standing ovation that carried gratitude rather than excitement. Daniel Whitmore remained near the back of the room, no longer hiding behind authority or polished confidence. He listened with thoughtful eyes, understanding that the greatest lesson of his career had arrived without humiliation, only accountability and the opportunity to become better than he had been that afternoon. Emily quietly approached Naomi as the applause faded and whispered that the board had approved a comprehensive guest experience initiative, mandatory inclusion training for all event leadership, and a new scholarship program named after the volunteers who demonstrated integrity under pressure. Naomi nodded once and replied, "Then tonight accomplished more than a fundraiser ever could." Cameras captured the moment, but the images that spread across the country the following morning were not photographs of expensive gowns or famous donors. They showed a woman in a simple navy dress standing beneath a portrait carrying her own name, smiling beside a young intern who chose honesty over silence. The headline written by the local journalist reached millions of readers before sunrise. Respect should never depend on recognition. Weeks later, Olivia would receive a handwritten letter inviting her to join the Brooks Foundation Leadership Fellowship. Daniel would volunteer for the first training session and remain until the final discussion ended. Guests would return the following year remembering not the decorations or the music, but the unexpected lesson waiting at the entrance. And every new volunteer would hear the same story during orientation, not as a warning, but as a promise that every person crossing those marble floors deserved the same welcome, the same dignity, and the same chance to belong. As the final notes of the orchestra drifted upward beneath the crystal chandeliers, Naomi looked across the ballroom she had built and quietly smiled, knowing that true influence does not arrive by speaking louder than everyone else. It arrives by raising the standard until kindness becomes the only language every room is expected to understand.